Are you seeing alliances being created?
The Russia-China connection got stronger. A lot of that was because of the oil relationship.
You want us to do business with China? We'll open up TikTok, but you got to open up Facebook, Twitter, all this other stuff.
The Hilton in Shanghai, you can actually get on Facebook and you can actually Google things, which I would not have known had I not physically been there.
Do you think the Fed did more good or bad to America?
We don't have free markets anymore.
That's kind of like saying Bezos, Buffett, Gates, these guys make all the decisions in the world.
I believe in fair capitalism.
What is the alternative, though?
I also believe in democratic socialism.
If America were to go back to gold standard, who would be against it?
Wall Street, the banking community.
It makes sense. Have you ever seen America as divided as we are today?
I have not seen it this tense.
How close are we to civil war?
On the streets or in the markets?
So I have an interesting guest with me today. I have Nomi Prins. I'm going to say the last name right. Nomi Prins with me, a guest that's got a lot to talk about when it comes down to the economy. She used to work 2 years as a managing director at Goldman Sachs, and she was there on the 29th floor when 9/11 happened and plane flew right by her corner office at Goldman Sachs. If you got a corner office, you got a corner office. I mean, that's where you want to be when you're working at a place like that. She was a senior managing director at Bear Stearns for 7 years. Senior strategist at Lehman Brothers, analyst at Chase Manhattan Bank. I mean, I can go on and on. Got her bachelor's in mathematics, my kind of a person. Then she got a minor in music and master's in science and statistics from NYU. She's written multiple books, one of them being Collusion, How Central Bankers Rigged the World in 2018 when the book came out. And the other one is All the President's Bankers. With that being said, Nomi Prins, thank you so much for being a guest on Valuetainment.
Yeah, thanks so much. A pleasure.
It's good to have you on. So first question, I'm going to start off with a soft question for you so we can kind of get to know each other. How close are we to civil war?
On the streets or in the markets?
Give me both.
Well, here's the thing. Over the last 10, 11 years since the financial crisis, and then you add on to that this pandemic, we've reawakened the economic instability that's inherent to many, many components of the economy and the population, right? So when you mix economic instability with crisis, with inherent problems that exist, whether it be social tensions, racial tensions, economic inequality, and you mix that all together, you have a very perilous situation. And if you put on top of that the fact that markets and the financial asset side of the equation has been helped by so much compared to the actual people part of this equation, then we are close. We're not even close. We are in the period of civil unrest throughout a lot of the world, including what we've seen recently in the US. But we're also at a point, and I call it a sort of permanent distortion between what's happening on the financial economy side in terms of also how it is helped and subsidized versus what's happening on the real or the foundational economy side, the small businesses, the individuals, and the things that they face. So that's where I think the civil element and the economic element are actually very much part of the same thing.
Okay, so you're saying we are there, we're not almost there, we are there. But do you think, I mean, maybe the question I'd ask might be slightly different. Have you ever seen America as divisive, as divided as we are today yourself? I mean, you lived in New York, you lived in different places, you've had a lot of different experience. You worked at some of the most reputable companies worldwide at their peak. People relied on them with the decisions that they made. You ever seen America at a point where people are divided, going at it, the riots, the protesting? You ever seen something like this yourself?
No, I mean, I think we're in a very divisive point in America's history, at least in the personal history that I've experienced in my lifetime, because of these kind of conjoining factors, because of the economy, because of finances, because of all the tensions that brings up, and because I think we are in a very polarized part of U.S. history. I think the world, to an extent, is polarized in many places as well, and so there's a sort of feeding between our country and other countries and so forth around the world. But I think the fact that we have as much sort of instability on so many levels of individuals, of the economy, of races, of social elements and so forth, I have not seen it this tense. So therefore, I've not seen it this bad. The financial crisis of 2008 definitely opened up more financial instability to a large swath of the population. That's definitely true. But there wasn't as much of a sort of tension and a sort of almost push to completely change out of our situation into something better for a lot of people, and the tension on the other side of others wanting to keep it exactly the way it is. And so that tension, I think, is really much more apparent now in the wake of this pandemic than it had been in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008 or anything that I have experienced. And that includes the wars that the U.S. has been in, and the demonstrations against those wars, demonstrations to reduce debt throughout the world, and so forth. This is more visceral. This is more spread out at the foundations of the country.
How much of this do you think is the media? How much of it is China trying to take over, meaning of control of power? Because there's a lot of moving parts right now. You got pre-coronavirus, we were talking Brexit, we were talking China, we were talking tariffs, we were talking Venezuela, we were talking Saudi Arabia, oil, Iran. We got a lot of different things we were talking about pre-coronavirus. So how much of it's media? How much of it's China? How much of it's coronavirus? How much of it do you think is Trump and or anything else that I may not be saying? But there's got to be something that's the tipping point that's causing this. What would you say it is?
I think there's a number of things that you mentioned that kind of come into play in sort of a pie type of portion, right? So, and I'm glad you bring up sort of how the international community, the international sort of globalized world was before the coronavirus, and now how it is, because a lot of it's the same, right? There's more tension now, there's more uprising now, but a lot of the issues are still there. For example, trade uncertainties between the U.S. and China, the sort of battle between the U.S. and China in terms of who's going to be the most legitimized superpower going forward that's going to mark the 21st century. We're still in the young part of the century, and a lot of stuff has gone down in terms of money-related crises during this century, but the result has been a lot of isolationism, sort of a new form of populism, a new form of sort of tariff controls and battles from that element of economics. And I think that's going to be ongoing to an extent. The China leveraged a lot of what happened in the financial crisis of 2008. I've analyzed this a lot and talked about a lot and been there and so forth since the financial crisis. But they basically leveraged the situation where our Federal Reserve, the way the U.S. whole monetary system was created and then moved into the new part of this century, and all the sort of cheap money and the asset buying, all the programs that the U.S. began in the wake of the financial crisis, and they physically leveraged this to do a number of things. One is to get the Chinese currency, the yuan, into the SDR, the security basket of the IMF, so to become a more legitimate currency in terms of trade. And they openly use that element. When I say they, I mean the former People's Bank of China head, in conjunction with the IMF. So they were trying to sort of pivot their power from the standpoint of our sort of loose monetary system with their more dedicated, as they saw it, monetary system. So while we were using that money as a country to basically invest ultimately in financial assets, the markets, and so forth, and they did quite well as a result, they were sort of using it to build alliances with countries that had been weakened in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008. And they did this with the BRICS countries. They had the alliance with Brazil grow substantially, such that they became the largest trading partner with Brazil relative to the US. And so there was this juxtaposition, this fight that was going on since the financial crisis between these two superpowers. And now you bring in years of that into the coronavirus pandemic. And there's still a lot of obvious tension in that relationship. But we're in a situation now where China had the virus sort of first and sort of got over it. There's still cases. Beijing is still closing in parts, but sort of. And the U.S. is still sort of grappling with what that's going to look like over the number of months. And so China is able to kind of resurrect that sort of power position. But they're also doing it in a way where they're containing Hong Kong, and they're sort of annoying a lot of the trade partners that they've developed over these last 12 years. And so that could mean a pendulum switch back to the US. But yet we're in a weakened part of our economy. So I think that pendulum swing between those two superpowers and how countries get sort of caught up in between that is actually a major point of general economic tension in the world outside of where it relates to like the individual to the population, to issues that people, small businesses, individuals are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So I do think that's a big component of where we are here, because all the dominoes sort of fall around that from a large economical standpoint. And then you go down from multinational companies using both countries to middle, to smaller, to a supply chain, to small businesses. And there's a lot going on back and forth behind the scenes of everyday life for, real people.
Typically when conflicts happen like this, what we're experiencing that's global, some relationships obviously deter, and there's a falling out, and then an enemy of an enemy becomes a friend. So
right.
People that weren't allies, they become allies. And so in this situation, are you seeing Russia, Iran, and China get closer? And are you seeing Iran, US, UK, and India get closer in this? Because, India's coming up. You just heard China's investing a few $100 billion in Iran, which obviously Asia relies on the Middle East for oil. 76% of their oil comes from Iran in the Middle East. Are you seeing alliances being created? And if yes, who got stronger, who got weaker?
So that's interesting as well. So the Russia-China connection it got stronger in the wake of the financial crisis and into today. And a lot of it was because, and you throw Iran into that more recently, a lot of that was because of the oil relationship. China is majorly growing population. They have turned to invest in their new sort of 5-year plans in green infrastructure, sustainability, fast trains, and so forth, but they are reliant still on wanting to have an independent supply of oil. And that's one of the sort of pivots that they've made to sort of find stronger alliances, create and establish and grow stronger alliances where that can be the case. The relationship between China and Russia into this period has also been one of a currency relationship. They have agreed to effectively transact in each other's currency along the way. And that's a way of kind of moving that from dollar-denominated based trade or the old petrodollar-based trade that sort of evolved out of the 70s and into today. It was a way to sort of combat that. So yes, that has been one element of strength in terms of alliances. China had also strengthened their alliances in sort of the Asian region, in the smaller countries. And they had actually had more conversations until kind of recently that went quite well with Japan, who had been an old adversary of China, in order to sort of solidify their alliances and create a lot of sort of commissions and sort of new agreements between China and Japan into this particular period. There hasn't been anything new in the last sort of year-ish, and there's also been more tension because of the South China Sea and other things going on in that area. But so there's been a sort of back and forth. In terms of the US and the UK and the UK and the EU and the EU and China, there's a lot of moving parts in that. I think with the UK, how Brexit will ultimately look in terms of agreements relative to the EU is going to give us more clarity on what happens relative to the US. Because what's gone on in this 6-month period, as the UK and the US have been dealing with the virus, 3 to 6, however this lasts, the UK had for a while kind of forgot about their Brexit conversations because they were dealing with what was on the ground, which was the virus. Same thing with the US. So conversations between them had kind of taken a little bit of a back burner in terms of how trade agreements would look. I think that's going to step up. I think that relationship, which has kind of not really gone anywhere very recently, is going to step up. And I think that China is going to have issues between the UK and Hong Kong and China, China and the EU, which are going to make that whole arrangement from a standpoint of trade diplomacy and power a little bit looser than it might otherwise have been, weaker than it otherwise might have been.
You think China trusts Russia? Well, let me ask it in a different way. You think Russia trusts China more than they trust US?
I think Russia would be trying to get what they can out of both sides.
Okay, I agree.
So I don't know. I don't know that it's necessarily a trust issue. It's a pragmatic issue. I think that they would be trying to balance. They are trying to balance.
I'm just wondering if they're trying to use capitalize off the opportunity right now that there's division between U.S. and China to get in there and say, hey, let's make our power plays. Because the one thing China and Russia has in common right now, it seems like they both want to capitalize off of Iran, which is weak right now with the sanctions, and the people there, the economy is not good. People are afraid, and the folks of power want to keep the power.
That's right.
And maybe both China and Russia are saying, let's try to capitalize. We don't care about being good with America, but let's just try to at least take advantage of the oil that's there with the challenges that's taking place. But do you think, are we getting to a point, like, do you remember when China was number 7 economy, GDP, and it wasn't like at the top, and nobody really looked at China as anything crazy. We just kind of knew China was there. And when I'm saying this, I'm saying 30 years ago, 25 years ago. It's been a couple decades ago, right? And then all of a sudden they did the Olympics, and the opening to the Olympics, which was incredible. Everybody was like, wait a minute, that's the best opening Olympic show I've seen. Do you think India's getting close to the point where they can compete for the top spot, or do you think they're decades away from being there?
That's really interesting, because the period that you mentioned in China, how it used to be. So my first big international kind of banking trip was to, well, basically China, Hong Kong, Philippines, Malaysia, that region. We did a kind of central bank trip, me and a couple people from Lehman who were working on some products. And so that was kind of my first international foray, because Lehman Brothers wanted to have more treasury government bonds sold into the Chinese central bank at the time. And so relationships was just sort of being created, and there was a power play on Wall Street as to who would basically become the People's Bank of China's, the central bank of China's, partner. And so that was one of the first trips that I went on. And at the time, streets of Beijing were like, obviously it was a long time ago, but the streets of Beijing were just, full of, no outside Westerners, or very, very few. I mean, we were very, very unique in that respect. And I remember at the time, the whole story was, well, this is going to open. Like, China's going to open. It's going to be a big thing. It's central banks can get involved. It's monetary, sort of authorities are going to get involved, and it's going to sort of be the next big thing. And it took decades for it to really become that from an international perspective. But it's not like it wasn't doing it then. It was just on a very sort of back burner. Nobody's really paying attention unless you were in it, kind of thing. So with respect to India, they're ahead of that position because they have been part of the BRICS, because they have created, the NDB, the National Development Bank, which is kind of this idea that there would be an IMF or World Bank equivalent to the West, that was sort of run by these 5 major nations. And so they have been, and they have obviously a lot of a technological advance. They have a strong population, and they're trying to work towards becoming that superpower. I don't think yet they're at the level where they're that sort of challenge. I would say maybe they're a decade and a half behind China. Not that they're not growing, but to sort of, if you think of the world as having 3 superpowers, let's say, as opposed to 2, which really we have. I think we're about at that trajectory. It could accelerate, but that's kind of what's going on. So it's a growing trajectory, but there's a lot of competition, right, from the 2 big powers and everyone who's trying to stack themselves in between, as well, while India is trying to promote itself, to elevate itself, I should say.
Do you think coronavirus and the stories and the speculation that, whether China released it or not, warfare, whatever you want to call it. Some say it came out, some say it's not. Let's not debate that, because neither one of us are doctors to talk about that. But I'm just saying, do you think that story hurt other countries trusting doing business with China? They kind of distanced themselves a little bit from China, started looking at other places where that could potentially benefit the people of India, where folks may say, look, I kind of trust India. They have a university called IIT. They develop incredible engineers. They seem to be better than MIT on a lot of different, scores that I look at. And I remember being in India. I don't know when it was, when we went to India, and we were there with the chairman of State Bank of, was it 2018 or 2019? We were there at an IIT with 5,000 engineers, myself and the chairman of State Bank of India, Arundhati Bachari. This woman is a leader amongst leaders. She was on the Forbes top 20 most powerful women around the world, 240,000 employees. And she said, India writes the most life insurance in the world. I'm like, come on. She says, no, we have the most life insurance policy holder. I said, what's the data? 316 million people in India have life. And 360, she says, yes. I said, what's happening with India? She says, just watch, India's going to come up. So do you think the event of coronavirus hurt others wanting to do business with China, and it benefited India to come up because more countries trust India than they do China?
I think there's two things on that. I do think that trust from the sort of multinational business community relates into where they see stability. So whether or not they trust that China did or didn't, or something happened that we don't know about, or whatever with respect to the virus, I think the sort of result of that would be wanting to do more diversification of their business in India, for all the reasons you mentioned, and also the fact that it has an open society from the standpoint of information flow. So if you look at all of that together, there's more of a sort of democratic release of information within India, and then from India to the outside world. And I think that actually is that pivot, is why India is therefore also more attractive. Aside from the growth, aside from the technology, aside from the minds, aside from the size, aside from the desire, is also that it has more of an openness within itself. And I think that's something that other countries can relate to a lot better. So I think with respect to China, that whatever has gone on or not gone on with respect to the virus, it's more indicative of the sort of nature that other countries can have relative to be more suspicious of China, simply because in general they don't allow the same level of communication flow amongst their people, obviously with what's happening in Hong Kong, and also for international people who are working or traveling in and out of China, or will be once all the barriers are sort of lifted throughout the world in terms of coronavirus bans. But I think that's an issue that is at the core, that transparency issue, that freedom of communication issue, which is what surrounds whatever happened with the coronavirus. I think that's something that countries and companies do very much consider.
Yeah, because when you think about superpower military-wise, you don't think India. You don't think about India as somebody that wants to go to war and wants to go. When you think about superpower, you think about nuclear, you think about Russia, you think about US, you think about, certain superpower. India comes across as wanting to be more collaborative to work with. And you're talking about a 1.4 billion, whatever the population is, give or take. I mean, that's not and they're focused on education, and, it's coming up. Their prime minister is a strong individual who believes in capitalism and innovation. So it's very interesting to see what's going to happen there with them. But I sit down with different people, and I always watch their reaction on how they feel about China. And I'm curious to know what you're going to say. When I talk to Ray Dalio about China, he has a different angle. When I talk to President Bush about China, different angle. I talk to General Spalding about China, different angle. Some of them we don't trust them at all. Some are very careful on what they say about China. And it's almost like they're uncomfortable because they have business dealings. How do you feel about China, and how do you view China yourself?
Well, I mean, I don't have business dealings with China myself, so I'll just throw that out there. But I've studied for the last, since the financial crisis in particular. I mean, aside from, I mentioned I've been in China back and forth for decades, but as I have lots of places in the world. But what I specifically look at is the kind of public communication that happens between the U.S. and China. And from my angle of expertise, the sort of central bank, the sort of monetary policy, sort of initiatives relative to currency that happen between the two countries. And so with respect to China, there was a lot of, and there still is, talk of whether they manipulate their currency or what have you to better sort of trade positions and trade advantages. And I think any country really that would to an extent, move their currency up and down to help their own position. And I think we've done that from the standpoint of our 0% monetary policy and the increase of the Fed's balance sheet. China's done it from the standpoint of moving their rates around and what they consider non-QE, which is moving money into their economy or lending money to regional alliances so that they become dependent on China. And so I look at more of a standpoint of how money's flowing around, and I don't really, and you can see from that perspective that there are points where China moved its money externally in order to build that strength, build those alliances, and then where they've kind of been questioned about overplaying that step, overreaching their alliances because of their military might. So from the standpoint of monetary policy, I think that they have tried to come into the world, but at the same, in terms of the IMF, in terms of trade, but at the same time, I think in terms of their military might or their sort of suppression of what Hong Kong wants to do and sort of their what they've done in the region, I think that's a negative. I think it's a negative for the region. I think it's a negative actually for China and for the world.
It's a negative for China and the world.
Because if you're just in terms of, and it's not that, it's that if you have the ability as a country to forge alliances or to leverage weaknesses with other countries, and let me talk monetarily, not militarily for a second. It's one thing to do that, to take advantage of that and to grow and do that. And China has done that over the last 12 years significantly. It's another thing to then overstep your sort of military might. The U.S. does this also. This is what countries do. They become powerful, and there's this like moment. There's multiple moments, but along the way there are moments where there's a choice to be made, whether sort of maintaining an economic, diplomatic alliance is the number one priority, or whether they're sort of overstepping from a more sort of bullying or sort of militaristic pivot. And those things could be back and forth. And I think with respect to China, they've had this run, and now they're in this position where they're overstepping the growth in their power effectively. And I think that's going to hurt China. And I think with respect to the US, that then potentially becomes an opportunity to the US, because I think there are lessons to be learned from using monetary policy, lending, investment to push your alliances as opposed to just, let's say, investing in markets. So I think both of these superpowers did things in different ways and do things in different ways, but there are lessons on both sides.
Before we get into the Fed, because I think you were kind of alluding to that, which we'll get to that here in a second, is how do you think President Trump's handled the tariffs, the trade war with China? How do you think that's been handled the last 12, 18 months?
Well, I think one of the results of the last 12 to 18 months is that both countries are trading less in general and with each other. So where we have less of a deficit in trade relative to China because of the tariffs, it hasn't helped our overall trade position in general, because the whole overall world, what has been happening as tariffs have been in play, have been sort of the battlefield, is that economies have also weakened at the same time. Now, you could argue, I could argue that economies have been destabilized throughout the world, US and China and every country around and in between, because of the uncertainty over tariffs. And I think the uncertainty over tariffs, we have them, we don't have them, they're going to be in a particular part of the industrial chain and a particular part of the supply chain, make it very difficult for certain businesses, particularly the ones that rely on physical things like steel, like aluminum, versus say the technology sectors, which don't as much. It's a kind of separate element of trade relationships, more intellectual property and another thing, but the ones that are more reliant on physical things, soybeans, agriculture, and so forth, it's harder for countries, but specifically the businesses that are running within those countries, to plan as long as there's uncertainty over tariffs. So I think that the way in which tariffs have unfolded throughout the world have led trade policy in general to be viewed with just tension. And I think as a result of that, if we just take out the coronavirus for just a second, which is just, smash things right now further, we were looking at slowing GDP growth in the US. That was happening throughout the world, as again, not just because of these tariffs or just because of trade, but it's a cycle. One sort of relies on each other. on each. And I think that that's one of the things that has been the negative of this particular tariff battle, is that it seems less planned and more reactive on all sides, really, than sort of a more consistent trade policy could be that farmers, that, you know, in industrial engineers that use steel and aluminum and build bridges or think about infrastructure planning, you know, have had to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, 128-month expansion, whatever the number one's, whether we hit 129 or 128, I mean, that's the all-time. It's insane to go that many months, assuming it's going to continue.
Right.
That's just not sustainable.
Right.
But, you know, I just, what is the alternative, though? Meaning, when you're saying negotiating with tariffs, when it happened, it hurt a lot of people, both America and other countries. What is the alternative of not pushing China, that for decades, none of the presidents, both on the left or the right, has pushed China? They're just kind of accepted the fact that a lot of these tariffs have been in place, and we've said we're fine with it. What would be the alternative? Just leave it the way it is? Because whatever administration that decides to go strong against China, whoever that president is that does it, they're going to have so many opportunities of it backfiring on them. I mean, there's just so many opportunities, because you have 4 years to get it done. And if you take the 4 years, take one out, because one of the years you're going to be campaigning. So you got 3 years, right? Because that 1 year, it's so painful. So, and then take the first year out. You really have 2 years to get it done. 2 years is not enough to get something done with China to negotiate the tariffs. And anybody who takes that position, it's going to be disastrous for their reputation. It could be great, it could be bad. So what approach would you have taken if you're sitting, Trump calls you and says, I want you to be one of my advisors when it comes down to the economy on dealing with China? What counsel, what advice would you give when dealing with China on how to handle the tariffs better than the way it was handled?
So first of all, the way it was handled wasn't just about China. There was a lot of tariffs that popped out, you know, to Canada and to Mexico, and then to you, and then EU to us. Yep. But what happened was just the way of tariffs became very sort of spotty.
Shotgun approach, just kind of like, hey, just put a tariff.
Well, I'm going to do this. No, I'm going to do that. No, I'm going to do this.
I got it.
So it isn't that there weren't certain products that should be protected, you know, on our side, and that there are things that we can negotiate in terms of trade policy, and in terms of whether we call them tariffs or whether we call them, you know, required, which kind of ultimately happened in the phase one deal, you know, purchases to sort of equate fairness amongst the variety of products that we have. So, you know, you buy a certain amount of our agriculture, we'll do something else in return. That kind of conversation in a more fluid way, and around the world, again, because it wasn't just what was happening between the U.S. and China. There was a lot of U.S. and other countries that in which there were these conversations going on as well. And I think that had they been a little more, my suggestion would be to have those conversations be a bit more strategic and sort of fluid from the get-go. That isn't to say that everyone does what they say. It's not to say every country's trustworthy. It's not to say everybody will do what they promise to do. However, in the basis of creating an agreement and a trade policy, I would look at what what our partners need and what we need from them. I would negotiate on those components mostly. If I am looking at trade policy with China, I would sort of ring fence that, and I would try to make it phased from the sort of beginning, as opposed to, I'm going to do these tariffs till this date, and if you don't do this, this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen. And I understand the nature of the sort of market part of that, but what it creates is a lot of instability in the supply chain all around that as well, and that in general has had a deteriorating effect. So it's almost like it's almost like that deteriorating effect made it harder to have the same impact of the trade policy than it otherwise could have been. So I would have probably sat back, said, take a breath, take 10. What do you actually want to accomplish? Do you actually want to involve, you know, wine from France, or, you know, whatever, like, you know, what's the actual focus here? Focus. and then look at a multi-tier, potentially multi-phase agreement that works.
That's interesting. And by the way, a part of it is also style, on what his style is. He's got a real estate shotgun approach. You're not giving me that deal, I'm going to take this away from you. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. So it's
well, that's the classic I walk away, right? It's like,
yeah.
you don't want this deal, I leave the room. You deal.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But on a international arena where people from, the person putting, gas into the tractor of the farmer in some, farm in, Iowa or whatever versus, a multinational executive versus everyone in between, there are different kinds of impacts. So yes, that is his style. I think history will ultimately look at whether that, was effective or if other styles are more effective with respect to this trade conversation.
Sure.
Or conversation. But I also think that in terms of general diplomacy, there could have been a way to do that walk away, but do it in here's our plan, here is kind of what we want to do, and actually have it more sort of laid out and discussed, as opposed to walking away every time and coming back and walking away and coming back. I think that's where the weakness came into play all around the world from the trade tariff battles.
Have you read The Art of the Deal?
I have not read The Art of the Deal.
Oh, you haven't read his book. It's a very good book. If you've not read the book, it's an excellent book. So let me ask another question that has to do with China. So if we're negotiating with China and the president's talking to you and the team is talking and they're saying, look, Nomi, you just brought up yourself, the currency manipulation is what they do, okay? And you said that they do currency manipulation, but you also said everybody else does it. Okay, fine. Yeah, let's just say everybody does it, but we know nothing about what they do because they don't have free press. We have no idea what they're doing. They tell us what their unemployment is. We don't know who's reporting the unemployment. It definitely cannot be 2.8% for the last 20 years. So the reporting of data, there's no integrity in it. You're dealing with 1.5 billion people to say you have unemployment of 2.8%. And there's currency manipulation. There is human rights challenges, the data we don't trust, a bunch of other things that we can get. Okay, you think it's fair to negotiate and say, moving forward, this is what we would like. We would like to see you open up China and allow Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, all our social media platforms to be there for your users so we can feel more comfortable opening up a business relationship with you and lift some of these tariffs, because through the media, with our media networks being there and our social media networks being there, all these Facebook lives and videos, we can see how people are being treated. Do you think that is a point to put in there as for negotiation for us to be able to see a little bit more of transparency with their model and how they're treating their business? Do you think it's a fair point to negotiate?
Yes, I do. And as I mentioned before, I think one of the main issues with regarding trust, and what we talked about, so whether it's the coronavirus or sort of beyond that, is that element of openness, is that element of information share, which is better, for example, obviously in India, is that idea of that transparency, because whether it allows us to see what's happening from a human perspective, from an individual perspective, from a small business to small business alliance perspective, say between the U.S. and actual, people running, same forms of shops or restaurants or whatever in China, I do think that is important. You may have seen this in your trips there, but I find it, for example, I continue to find this interesting. I just had this conversation recently with someone who goes back and forth a lot. Is that in Shanghai, for example, and I can't speak to other areas, the Hilton in Shanghai, in particular, has this sort of clubby thing at the top, and everybody sort of comes in, whether they're in textiles or equipment or technology or programming or whatever, and they all sort of like hang out and they communicate with each other, and then they sort of go their separate ways. And it's a very sort of internationalized element of China. And there you can actually get on Facebook and you can actually Google things. So it's like there's this, and I don't know if that's still the case. This was just in the recent couple of years, but I did find that odd because it was this. There was a separate anti-firewall sort of situation in a particular area, which was particularly critical. And it was in Shanghai.
Did you hear that?
Which I would not have known had I not physically been there. And I mean, and so there is a capacity to perhaps do what needs to be done when it has a very particular business focused outcome, perhaps, than from the standpoint of the overall country. And so this was before tariffs. This was before actually this was when I was writing Collusion. So I would say this was 2016, 2017, probably 2016 actually, it was before the election. But the point being that if you talk about transparency and the sharing of communication platforms and information from that perspective, I think it is important in today's world, period, whether that is for business or for humanity, to have that open policy and to request that open policy, and to have that open policy be a criterion potentially for trade agreements.
Exactly. That's the part. And I don't know why administrations in the past haven't negotiated in that manner, both on the left and the right. They just kind of left China alone. And the way we left China alone, we allowed them to be a superpower that they are right now, number two. It was with the help of America. You take America out, China wouldn't be number two. China needed America to be number two right now worldwide. You know, I say this to you because yesterday an article came out on Business Insider talking about FBI head. I don't know if you saw this or not. FBI head calls China the greatest long-term threat to the U.S. and alleges China plots to steal U.S. data and forcibly repatriate its citizens. And it goes into talking about the Chinese government is engaged in broad and diverse campaign of theft and malign influence, and it can execute the campaign with authoritarian efficiency. They're calculating, they're persistent, they're patient, and they're not the subject to righteous constraints of an open democratic society or the rule of law. So for me, I'm kind of glad Pompeo, India shut down TikTok. You saw that. India had TikTok there, and one young girl committed suicide, and she was a big TikTok star. India that just said, let's shut down TikTok because China was able to get into it and pull up all your data. Like if you use TikTok on your phone and you leave it on, China can go on your phone and pull up any passwords and anything. They just said, oh, we didn't know we had that. Yeah. And US has 180 million users on TikTok, and Pompeo just said yesterday that they're considering banning TikTok in US, which I believe it's a brilliant strategy because this adds to the point of you want us to do business with China, we'll open up TikTok, but you got to open up Facebook, Twitter, all this other stuff when it comes down to you. So right. That was a very good perspective you gave at Shanghai Hilton, but did you have a rebuttal to that or respond to that?
No, I agree that the idea of having a sort of quid pro quo for the sharing of information platforms, the opening of information platforms, I think it's a necessity today, honestly, to have ultimately trustable trade relationships, agreements, and also for companies doing business. Now, it's not, international companies will be doing business in and with China. So the more, as they are, right? So the more that there's also this sort of entire atmosphere of openness, or at least a more open atmosphere than there is now from the standpoint of these platforms, I think that just levels that whole field. And I think that with respect to China growing as a superpower relative to the US, I do think a lot of that, it did happen from the standpoint of what hurt us into the financial crisis of 2008 and how they sort of capitalized and leveraged our system, our monetary system, our banking system, in order to grow their alliances and in retaliation kind of to our, at that point, instability inside at home.
What are the chances of Trump and his administration using the crisis that took place with coronavirus and blaming it on them to write off the $1.13 trillion of debt that we owe them and just say, we're just not going to pay you back this debt? What are the chances of that also being used in the negotiation? What are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts on that are that over the years, there's been a lot of back and forth on how much the People's Bank of China, how much China owns of our treasury bonds, our debt, and whether they will dump them from their side. So there's always been that question. Can they do something to us by dumping treasuries? Can we do something by them by refusing to pay? Which you bring up. So both sides of that equation, I think, might be discussed. But the reality of the situation is, it would hurt us to not pay, even if it's China. It doesn't matter.
Why is that?
To sort of renege, because look at it as a full portfolio of treasuries. Right, we have a $27 trillion portfolio of treasuries in the world. Japan owns a piece. China owns a piece. Different central banks throughout the world, including the Fed, own a piece. Individuals own a piece. Pension funds own a piece. Right, everyone has a piece of this portfolio.
Sure.
So just imagine you take out 5 or 10% of a portfolio like that. Right, you all of a sudden basically devalue, and this is the little price devaluation. I mean, I'm not even talking about the implicit guarantee or the government guarantee of our treasury bonds or anything like that. I just mean physical, portfolio math. That all of a sudden you have a situation where you devalue yourself, your own debt, by either not repaying debt. And China, that was one of the reasons why they didn't, I think, sell all their treasury bonds. They stopped buying as many. That's true. Right, so they already kind of tried to play that. But what they also tried to do is look at their portfolio of treasury securities and say, you know what, if we just dumped them, like the world was saying we might do, that would devalue their portfolio. It would obviously devalue treasury bonds, but it would also devalue that. And it's the same thing for us. If we decide to do anything that calls into question, even with whichever country owns our treasuries, I personally think that would be detrimental to our own debt, which would make our debt more expensive because there's so much of it, our public debt, which would make it harder for us to run our budget and so forth. Because it only takes 5 to 10% of a portfolio declining. I mean, to just smash like the rest of it from a standpoint of pricing.
It's a very different perspective. And I appreciate that insight, because it makes you think about, but is there a way to say, return the shares or write it off, not versus not even wanting to do it, because if they do, then on the credit market, our, reputation is hurt, and it's going to hurt us to deal with other nations when we have money that we need, et cetera, because China's not even the biggest holder of our bonds. It's Japan's first place ahead of China by like $100 billion or $200 billion.
Right.
I'm just curious to know if that's going to be used or not. Again, I watch, you know how you negotiate. You have 20 different things on the table. And you say these 7 things I really want, and these 3 things I'm not willing to touch at all. And they say these 8 things we really want, and these 4 things we don't want to touch. And but you don't know that person's, they don't know yours. And you kind of assuming. I wonder if that's being used on the table by either party to use it as a motive. And by the way, China may even use it to say, look, here's what we'll do. You owe us this much money. Here's what we're willing to do. I don't know. I'm just thinking if they're the level of creativity that's going to get to when they negotiate.
I think that's interesting. I think, whether it's on the table or not, and it might be, but the reality is China's effectively lent us money, and we either pay them back or don't. Right? I mean, that's the sort of scenario we're talking about potentially. But they can choose not to lend us money. They can let their portfolio run down, and that's actually a position of power in terms of debt holding that they have relative to us. Because if we say we won't pay, it hurts us more than if they run down their portfolio and just don't buy more treasuries, which kind of has been what they're doing. As you say, Japan has jumped ahead of China in terms of who has the biggest book outside of the US. Actually, the biggest book is the Fed. So years ago, this wasn't even like a thing. So now basically the Fed has the same amount of treasuries as China and Japan, which kind of dilutes their shares, if you will, in the portfolio of treasuries. So I think it could potentially be a tactic, and it might even be something that's thrown out and that financial media or discusses, and that could hurt or help the treasury market depending on what side and what day. But right now, I think that it would actually harm us, particularly with how we're increasing our debt load into the coronavirus pandemic after the financial crisis, and with the Fed's balance sheet, just ballooning. Then I think it would hurt them. So
you're talking about a president who got the bank to write off $900 million of his debt. So I'm just saying, in his mind, if he treats everything as a business, and even his tactics of You don't want to do this for us? 25% tariff. Mexico doesn't want to do this? 25% tariffs. Oh, I'm going to lift the tariffs. I'm sorry. 3 days later. Oh, Canada. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. It's like, it's so shotgun, you know,
Shotgun.
but I'm just saying, assuming his reputation and his method of negotiation in the past, you know, to him, it's only one additional zero. You know, he's only dealing with a couple additional zeros. He's not dealing. That's the only difference for him. He doesn't see it as anything more than that. I believe. I may be wrong. Who knows? So let's talk about Fed. Let's talk about the Fed, because you've spoken about the Fed before. And I've had Danielle DeMartino Booth here. I don't know if you're aware of her. She,
Yes, I know.
okay. And we've had other people that we talked about the Fed before. But, you know, one question for you is, the Fed has always got a lot of conspiracies tied to it, right? It's always why it got started, who started it, what was the motive behind it. You know, the whole Jekkyl Island, you know, the whole Jekkyl Island. I don't know if you've read the book or not. Maybe, I don't know if that's the book you've read or you haven't read that one.
So I actually spent time at Jekkyl Island. I went through the actual physical.
So you're a part of this whole deal. We finally figured this out.
See what happened, to actually see for myself, as I do when I do research, to talk to their archivists and actually look at one of the books that they had guest books. Now, this is not conspiratorial, this is just a fact. And who signed them, and who signed them around 1910 when the sort of origins of what became the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 were discussed. And I have read the Jekkyl Island book. In fact, I've also read all of the presidential archival papers from Woodrow Wilson through Taft, you know, before that, and also from the Morgan Library when I wrote All the President's Bankers. And part of that, Patrick, part of that was to see for myself. I wasn't born an expert on the Fed. You know, I was in banking for a long time. The Fed and rates were an Alan Greenspan, and waiting for what he said was very important when I was involved, specifically working in investment banking. But to see what really happened. And whatever is said from a conspiracy or not, the reality is that the Fed was created out of necessity, because there had been a panic in 1907 in New York. And it was a situation whereby the bankers were called upon, Morgan and a number of key bankers were called upon to try and calm things down by Theodore Roosevelt, who otherwise was a trust buster, who otherwise didn't trust, you know, big business in general. But that was what was required between the president and the bankers at that time. But what it created was an uncertainty among the bankers as to how they could ultimately save themselves in the next crisis. And that was one of the impetuses for figuring out how to have a central bank, a reserve of money somewhere that could ultimately, and they didn't use these terms, these are, you know, I'm putting today on yesterday, but be bailed out if it was needed, or have the markets be liquefied if it was needed. And that was one of the ways in which the Federal Reserve ultimately came into being when it came into being in 1913. It didn't happen under Roosevelt, didn't happen under Taft, it happened under Woodrow Wilson. But it was a pretty bipartisan push, so it didn't really matter who was president. It was an issue of timing. And that ultimately created from a meeting that had happened at Jekkyl Island in 1910 to the establishment of the Federal Reserve through that act in 1913. And the Fed has most recently, in the financial crisis of 2008, fast forward about 100 years, very much helped the markets, the banking system, and expanded its capacity, you know, by trillions and trillions of dollars most recently in order to do that.
So you went to Jekkyl Island, and the 6 names, the Nelson Aldrich, the Piat Andrew, Henry Davison, Arthur Shelton, Frank Vanderlip, Paul Warburg. Did you see all of those names there, or no?
No. Let me go back. First of all, there is a picture of all of them there, but that came later, and that's in the main hall, the main eating area. But no, what I saw was Morgan's actual signature as someone who had been at Jekkyl Island as one of the club members. So the way Jekkyl Island worked, and this I also got information from their historian, is the way that Jekkyl Island worked. It was a club. It was sort of, well, as he said, it was kind of like the first condominium for, like, you know, the equivalent of billionaires at the time, where they would go with their families predominantly over the end of the year. So like a Thanksgiving, Christmas kind of a period. And there would be a tremendous, like, count of sort of servants to individuals. They basically had all the comforts that they would have sort of at home, but at Jekkyl Island. They would close off the avenues to go to Jekkyl Island. Now there's a highway kind of overhang, but then there wasn't. You had to come by boat. They would put posts throughout the town saying, this is closed, this is the period people are going to be here, it's going to be closed. And you had to have a membership. So Henry Hyde, the Rockefellers, Morgan, this is not conspiratorial, this is in their history, to just come, to just physically walk onto that property from your boat at the time. And one of the things that happened at the time was you could have guests, but they had to be sponsored by an individual who had a club membership. And so what happened at the time was the commonality actually of JP Morgan was with Aldrich, and Aldrich's son actually, who was a New York banker at the time, but who wasn't involved in the six people. He just happened to have been a New York banker. He became, Winthrop Aldrich became the head of Chase for decades. But at that time he was not. But the point is there was that relationship, and it was Morgan that actually just had the pass. He wasn't there, he wasn't involved, he was not physically at all at Jekkyl Island at that time that the origins of the Fed were being discussed, but he was the name on the book that was associated with these individuals. And so that's kind of how it came down. They would otherwise not have been able to just get physical access onto the property. It's like any now, elite club thing. It's like you invite people in or they can't come in.
You're talking about six men apparently that controlled a quarter of the wealth of the world. That's the data that you hear about, so it's you read about it, but again, so a lot of people said it was a spoof about what the author wrote about him, and he said a lot of other things, but it's a story that picked up a lot of attention on how the world wealth is controlled by a few handful of people. How much do you buy into that?
Well, so these six people weren't necessarily all those people. What happened was, like, Frank Vanderlip, who was one of the people, was a sort of VP at National Citibank, which is now Citigroup. So I mean, there are different people that were involved in the major banks at the time. So yes, there was an awful lot of money represented at that meeting, and Nelson Aldrich was the head of what we now consider the Senate Finance Committee. And so he was a very established senator, and he had been going back and forth to Europe around this time anyway to collect information for Congress to create a central bank. So it wasn't like that, this was all done at the spur of the moment. This was something that was sort of being done and sort of being analyzed for a while. But what happened was the plans, the blueprint that was created at Jekkyl Island, that was then presented to Congress in 1910, and it was debated in Congress under Taft and then ultimately under Woodrow Wilson. Those blueprints were presented to Congress, and this is in the Congressional Archives. This is not, this just happened. And yeah, I have the footnotes in my book, but this was something that's actually occurred. Two of the bankers actually presented the idea to Congress initially because Nelson Aldrich actually had been ill for various reasons at the time, or at least that was said at the time. In fact, and this was in the New York Times at the time, he had been hit by a trolley car. If you can even imagine trolley cars going down Madison Avenue. But before he went to Jekkyl Island, according to New York Times, he was actually in a trolley car situation. I don't know how badly he was hit, the article, but the point is, so anyway, he was convalescing throughout this period. He did not, because of that or other reasons, actually initially present the plan to Congress. It was presented by two of the bankers that were involved in those six people. So whatever is said or not said, the facts of the situation was that there were those people, as we know historically, in that room, and as is currently up at Jekkyl Island, which is now a regular resort. It's been converted over the years. But the presentation of the initial blueprint for what became the Federal Reserve was presented initially by two of those people. And ultimately, it was passed several years later with a lot of back and forth from multiple bankers and multiple senators and multiple House of Representative Congress people to figure out how they could pass it in such a way that it was palatable to sort of the electorate, to the country. And one of the ways, yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I could go on and on.
Well, by the way, it's very interesting. So the audience is going to be curious about this. So how much of what is written in The Creatures of Jekkyl Island is accurate, and how much of it is conspiracy?
Well, I think the accurate parts had to do with the travel down to Jekkyl Island and how it was sort of done. I mean, it was done in a way to avoid publicity. Of course, publicity was different then than it is now. It wasn't 24/7. It was newspapers. Yeah. It was totally different. But so it was easy. It was easier to do that. But the sort of clandestine way in which, you know, the dead of night and all that kind of stuff, it's dramatic. It's kind of more dramatic in terms of the telling of the story. But that did happen. In fact, in Frank Vanderlip's notes, and his family has a foundation established library for basically his records. And he was a prolific writer. He had been a reporter actually before he became a banker. I did the opposite actually. Just I was a banker and now a reporter. But the point is that he actually, as do a number of those families, have notes and records that they kept very much for sort of posterity. There was a real sense back then, in particular in that part of the country and that part of our history, that they felt themselves to be bigger than themselves, in that they had to tell they wrote a lot about what was happening, much more than happens today. And so the story of going down and the people that went down and how it was done in a clandestine manner was from Vanderlip's own records. Now, he could have been embellishing it. That's entirely possible. I don't know. That was like, you know, he's dead. But that I don't know. And in terms of how that book brought it up, again, it was more dramatic than even the dramatic telling of it by someone who was a reporter / writer before he became a banker. However, the actual mechanics of the story, the sitting down, the number of days that they were there, and he also wrote about what they ate and all kinds of stuff. I mean, he had some very Vanderlip, not in his own notes. That could have been for effect. I don't know. But the actions that like occurred out of it, and the documents that came back to Congress, and the fights in Congress over the passage or not passage, or what it would look like and how it would go down, that all is pretty much, at least from my telling of it, in that I use the records themselves, information that's accessible to the public beyond the sort of more larger story that has kind of grown up around it.
Who do you know that knows as much about the Creatures of Jekkyl Island as much as you do? Who do you know? Anybody? Have you met anybody who knows us? Because you really went in to find out everything about it.
Well, so I did this not just on that. I mean, my book, and this is not to, but like All the President's Bankers was like my like work for, I lived and breathed these presidents, from library to library of the presidents, and also whatever historical event sort of intersected their presidencies. In this case, it was Wilson. Well, from Roosevelt through Wilson. I don't know. I did Bill Grider's book. So I think it's I'm going to forget the name now, but it's Bill Grider was obviously a major Fed historian as well. And he's written more about the combination of history and current, into mostly the Alan Greenspan days. Mm-hmm. And so he was one of the sources. Well, his book was one of the non-publicly archival available information sources for all the president's bankers. So in terms of the history, those were probably the two main books out there, the two main authors.
Secrets of the Temple.
Secrets of the Temple.
How the Federal Reserve runs the country.
Right. So he has a section in there that goes into the history and that sort of period and how it was created in the conversations that took place. I specifically read all of Woodrow Wilson's papers.
So let me ask you this. There's something I read about what Woodrow Wilson wrote, and it's so interesting that you're saying this because I got it right in front of me. Did he say this or did he not say this based on the research that you did? He said this apparently in signing of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, his book, The New Freedom, back in 1916. He said, "I'm a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its systems of credit Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all of our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and thirst of a small group of dominant men. Did he say this?
So I can't verify word for word what he said, but in terms of his papers, what I found is that he said a portion of what you read, and that in terms of the actual, and I could probably turn around and get the quote or send it to you, but in terms of actually what he wrote, or that was compiled in the Presidential Library of Woodrow Wilson, it's not verified. However, that doesn't mean it didn't happen, that he didn't say all of that as that quote goes. But it means that it isn't necessarily captured in the papers that are in the presidential combination of Woodrow Wilson's.
Is it relatively close to what I read? Meaning,
so
it
is very. Yes,
okay.
Sorry.
No, I'm saying, is it close? Is the yes. writing that you have, is it close to what I read? Relatively close to the same beliefs?
It is relatively close. Yes.
Wow. So he regretted the decision of the Federal Reserve, the Fed being put together.
He regretted the idea of the Federal Reserve. He didn't regret that it was put together, and I'll tell you why that distinction, just to be sort of historical. In the wake of World War I, so World War I begins, he's in a situation where he's running the country, trying to keep the U.S. basically out of World War I in the beginning of it, right? We're a nascent country, trying to become our own power, but like way new in the whole game. He actually relied on the Federal Reserve and the bankers to work together when ultimately he was pushed into, or decided, or however you look at it, going into that war. To basically help the Allies. And part of that decision was based on the reliance of the bankers on the Fed, right? They just created this new thing, but they hadn't used it. They hadn't needed to use it. He didn't need to use it, right? And all of a sudden, we have the need to raise money to be a part of a war, or at least to fund our allies. The first thing we did was fund our allies, not enter the war. So the UK, France, and then we ultimately were involved toward the later part of that war. So in the beginning part, he relied on actually the Morgan relationship, just because it happened to have been involved in financing, just physical percentage-wise, of war-related activities, and then some other banks because of war-related bonds that then people bought to finance part of the war. But he did rely on it at that point as the backstop for the banks. So it could have been a situation where he definitely talked about being concerned about having an elite group of bankers or a Fed running the finances of the country. However, also in a situation where he believed it to be sort of expeditious for policy, kind of didn't. So it's just not entirely black or white in that respect. I think
No.
He was a very intelligent president. He did things right and he did things wrong, right, as they all do. But I think he weighed that. I don't know him. This is just from my readings, obviously. I think he weighed the benefits with the negatives, as the situation kind of like presented itself. And war was a big situation.
That's kind of like saying Bezos, Buffett, Gates, Ellison, a handful of these guys make all the decisions in the world. It's the Walmart family to be able to do that. But America's in so much debt that America goes to billionaires to bail them out. And Chase was a powerful man at that time to be able to You know, can you imagine a person bailing out a country and supporting out? That's a weird place to be, to have that kind of wealth.
I mean, 1893, 1907. You know, you had those families. You know, particularly the mortgage. So you had them have more money than the government, and even when you talk about basis on those guys today, you still have that balanced to a very large book of treasury bonds and a very large sort of economy. We didn't have that as a nation back then. So the power actually was quite more acute back then, because it was concentrated relative to what the government had in a much, much greater quantity. I mean, yeah, you can't imagine President Trump calling up, well, Jamie Dimon and saying, can you loan me out of like your personal money, you know, something to help me with this whole China negotiation thing, right? I mean, it doesn't happen today.
Yeah.
But back then, you know, the largest trust buster, you know, from a reputational perspective, and, you know, he's on Mount Rushmore, Teddy Roosevelt, he sent his Treasury Secretary to do it, but he had to ask Morgan for help. So
I mean, obviously, it's a different time. We were not as powerful. We were not as thick. We were not as strong. We didn't have the kind of revenues that we had. We didn't even have the tax system yet. When the first taxes was what year? 1913 wasn't when we first had our 1913, give or take. So you're talking about there is no revenues coming in for him to be able to do anything. So it makes sense. It makes sense for the richest people to be the people that you got to go to give you the money. Do you think the Fed did more good or bad to America?
Over history or now?
Over history.
Well, I think over history, the Fed wasn't, though it was powerful, it wasn't as powerful as it's become recently. So it has done a disservice, I think, recently, i.e. really this century, more so because it's been the backstop of what it considers to be liquidity, or part of its dual mandate of you know, achieving sort of price and unemployment stability. And in doing so has created a real financial hazard in terms of the cheaper rates and the buying of right now every single type of security, and also doing that in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008. So it's taken out, you know, we talked about transparency before, in a different manner. It's taken out sort of price transparency from the markets, and also the drive to use capital for the purposes of more infrastructure, more production, individuals' employment, growth, development, and so forth. Because capital, by virtue of having been backstopped its risk that the banks had, you know, imbued upon us in financial crisis of 2008, before that, going into this period, has been backstopped by the Fed. And what that's created is this ultimately, I think, unstable environment where the Fed has to either continue to keep doing what it's doing in more magnitude, which it did this coronavirus pandemic versus the financial crisis, or things are going to collapse. And I think in the history of the Fed, there was more external ups and downs in the economy, but there was more of a sense, if you look at the, you know, post late 40s, 50s, 60s into the 70s, there was a sense of developing the country, whether that was from the standpoint of, you know, highways, of infrastructure, of bridges, of roads, of highways, of hospitals. At the time, a lot of building was done in our country in the middle of the last century. And that's because that's where capital decided it could get a return. It was for other reasons too, right? But from the standpoint, if we just talk about sort of, you know, capitalism and the Fed's risk and how that's destabilized the economy, which ultimately hurts the population and real people and creates this disconnect between the financial markets and the real economy, I think it's been a negative. It looks good when there's a real crisis at that moment to throw money at the problem, but it doesn't actually sustain the economy beneath that problem, and it doesn't fix the economy. Not that it's its job, but it doesn't allow for the fixing or the sustainable planning of the economy because of that. So I think it's done more harm than good in this century, and I think it's a toss-up in parts of last century, simply because other things were going on from an economic growth perspective that kind of competed with what the Fed was doing with respect to, at that point, mostly interest rates.
I think a lot of people are going to agree with you on that. I think many people would agree with you on that, no matter what side of the aisle they're on. And but we're at a point of no return. What can you do at this point? Meaning, if we wanted to, we're in too deep to do anything about it. To make a change right now, you know, sometimes you talk to these bigger companies and you say, AIG, your technology sucks. You got to change it. It'll take us 4 years to change it. Oh my God, I can't wait 4 years. Well, we're too big. We're so big. It's not like a smaller, nimble company, like when America was smaller, a little bit more nimble to make changes. We're at a point of no return. But who would hate the most if America were to go back to gold standard? Who would hate it the most? Who would say absolutely not? Who would be against it?
Wall Street, the banking community would be against it. And here's why. And I don't see us, for the record, going back to a gold standard or, I just don't see that because of this, or among other because of this, because the banking community, having established a reliance on the ability to have our currency created when it's needed, Fed can grow its books, Fed can move the level of our currency up and down. So there is that symbiotic relationship between Wall Street, the major bankers, major financial institutions, and the Fed. It's most tight between those two groups than it is between, you know, Facebook and the Fed or Google and the Fed. You know, there's a very strong relationship between those two. And the reason that in the 70s there was such a push to get off of the gold standard, among other things, and this is something that was building from what had happened in 1933, but then we went back on, we went back off, is that the banking community back then, I also have this in the book, the banking community back then really pushed Nixon, who ultimately did it, but really pushed him to reconsider having a gold standard. And one of the reasons, in other words, to get off it. And one of the reasons for that was that they couldn't really grow and expand from their own capital perspectives with their own backstop, the Fed, or just the idea of moving money in general, if it was tied down, if it was tied to something physical, if it was tied to something that other nations, other actors had more or as much control of as they did. And so the idea of floating off of it, and the idea of having solely a currency based on sort of a fiat nature to a currency, is actually very palatable if, as a bank, you have a call on that currency. And with gold, gold was more constraining. And I think gold would be more constraining. And I think that's something that actually presidents have said on both sides since then. Ben Bernanke, as the head of the Fed, was very much against the concept, even it was brought up in the wake of the financial crisis, because gold was going up, the dollar was sort of hobbling along, things were sort of crippled. He went on record in front of Congress and defended the even possibility of returning to a gold standard. I mean, so did the Obama administration. I mean, this was but it's more because of the banking community that would hate it the most.
Let me ask you, if we are on the gold standard, is quantitative easing possible?
It's much harder for that same reason.
Okay.
Is it possible? It's possible if we're not 100% on the gold standard, right? Because you have that leeway.
But if we are, let's just say if we are 100%, it's not possible, right?
It's not possible. You can't create gold, right? So you can't elasticize gold or the relationship of gold to your currency, because you can't create it.
Yeah. It keeps a nation disciplined, though. I mean, do you think the right thing is to be on gold standard? Is that the responsible right thing for the future of a nation?
I think simply being on the gold standard today, given the sort of globalized nature of today in currencies and sort of where they interact, I think it would just be difficult to actually achieve. I do think a portion, if we looked at sort of composite currencies, I think a portion of gold is useful in restraining that sort of, we can grow our balance sheet as much as we want. We will be here to buy all your mortgage-backed securities, your asset-backed securities, your commercial. Yeah, we can't have that. It would act, I think, as a way to contain that sort of balance sheet blow up and QE, which I think would ultimately be better because it would force sort of economic decisions that are based on real capital being available right now, as opposed to manufactured capital being available for markets whenever.
Are you someone who studied the you sound like when you go into topics and you're obsessed about it, you fully go study everything. Are you someone that ever got any interest in the JFK assassination, or not at all? That wasn't something that intrigued you much.
It's interesting. I do cover in All the President's Bankers his assassination, but not from this, not in a sort of deep dive. I more looked at his relationships to the banking community, to what he said with respect to Latin Americans who are opening the country and borders and everything else. And so I didn't. I don't. It's not my area.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious to know if you went into the people who were not happy about the direction he wanted to go with Fed and gold and all that, and
well,
they were not.
I did look at the one comment about that because there was because there's so much out there. There's so much sort of inquiry over the concept of, was it the Fed, was it gold, was it that he wanted to take another direction, but sort of in a limited way. So I can't really.
Fair enough. So we're not going to. I thought we were going to figure that out today, Nomi. I was hoping the world was going to figure that out today.
I was on the grassy knoll though. I was there because I was looking up, sort of the possibility of, but it just didn't fit into the overall structure of. And it was a black hole. It would have been a very deep black hole. I would have never finished the book. Never finished the book.
I agree with you. Yeah. I've probably interviewed 15. Mario, how many people have we interviewed on the topic of JFK assassination? I mean, from people who held the brain in the autopsy room to Clint Hill, his Secret Service, agent, but it's a black hole that'll last a lifetime. I mean, we had Robert F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on, and I asked him about how much investigation he did. He said he wrote a book about it, and he really went down the rabbit hole. If you've not seen that interview, the last 30 minutes is very interesting. So final thing here, topic to touch on before we go into the speed round, is Europe, yourself. Do you consider yourself a capitalist? Would you say you're a capitalist? You believe in capitalism?
I believe in fair capitalism.
Do you believe in socialism?
I also believe in democratic socialism.
So what do you think is too much taxes to? So I asked the question more with numbers. So you're a data person, and I've looked at this a lot. I'm curious to know what you're going to say. Let's take aside capitalism and let's take aside socialism. Let's not give it any labels. Let me ask this question. I make $100,000 a year. How much money is too much for me to pay the government in taxes?
What should the ban be? I think that depends on where you live making that money, for one thing. So your $100,000 in New York versus your $100,000 in Iowa.
Federal taxes. Just look at it from a federal tax standpoint. Don't break it down with states. So state California 13.3. If I'm in Tennessee, 0. If I'm in Texas, 0. Florida, 0. Just assume federal. I make $100,000 a year. How much is too much taxes for me to hand over to the government for the hard work that I put in? How much is too much?
Of that full 100, again, it depends what you get back for. Given what we get back for it here, I think the 33-40% level is fair.
Okay, but so
that's on $100,000. That's on $100,000.
So that's on $100,000. Okay, how about $1 million?
I think on $1 million, I think there could be. I agree with a sort of proportional tax percentage on that. So if I say 33 1/3 or 40% is a max for $100,000, I could see that as like the first $100,000, and then sort of a gradient in a slightly lower direction to get up to the million, but still taxing, that is a proportional amount.
So up to $100,000, 33.5%. Okay, up to $250,000. Let's just say you're saying 40%. If I'm making million up, what should be my taxes $1 million up?
Well, again, I think you just do that same 40% or whatever the grid is.
Okay, fair enough. Got it. So from 33.5 all the way up to 40.
Right.
Fair. Okay. So then the state you're in, the state I used to be in, you're in California. I'm in Texas now. Your state is 13.3. Do you think that's too much to be living in a state of California?
Well, there are certainly taxes in California. I do pay them, a lot of them. But I also think one of the things California does, which other states don't do quite as much, is it sort of does referendum out the things that people have to spend their taxes, the things that are voting, people can vote on to basically decide where their taxes go. This referendum is on the ballot, right? It's kind of the equivalent of. So it's like if I'm getting stuff for my marginal proportion or additional proportion of taxes, I think that's, and a state does that well, or a nation does that well, if you sort of move out of California, I think that's a good thing. And so at a certain level of earning, it's not as necessary. But for sort of individuals on the ground where, there's health concerns, there's education concerns, there's safety concerns, all of that, I think money needs to come into the system to be able to sort of make it run.
California is taking that to a whole different level, and they're losing a lot of people, especially the younger, hungry people, not the people that already made their money, because there's a different story between your money-making years versus you deciding you take your money to a place. For instance, I was in Monaco for our 10-year anniversary, my wife and I. We went there, and the city is smaller than Central Park, right? And the life expectancy in Monaco is the highest in the world. People live 89 years. Yeah, this is after they made their $100 million and they moved to Monaco. That's different. You don't see a 22-year-old saying, I'm going to go make my money in Monaco, right? They're going to go to a different place. As a money-making years of your life, 25 to whatever the number is going to be, 55, let's just say, where you're willing to play offense and go out there and work the 12, 16-hour days, do you think it's fair, the kind of taxes a state like California is passing down to its people?
Again, I think for the people just starting out and the people making less, that I would equate, or sort of lower that tax relative to people making more, the people you're talking about who have more, who have more to be taxed than someone just coming in. I mean, I started out in New York City, where my entire paycheck went to, I started out at Chase as an analyst. I mean, my paycheck basically went to taxes and my rent, and that was like it. So I do think that it does matter, like you say, whether you're coming in early in your life, in your career, in your money-making situation, or if you're someone who works on tips, or if you're someone who works multiple jobs, or if you're someone who works gig jobs, that I do think it's better to have a lower tax rate for those people, to get them into the economy and to help them build that sort of stability relative to people who have made more or have more. That's what I was talking about in terms of a proportional sort of taxing, because that makes them stay, and it also brings a foundational kind of economic stability to those people, and therefore, ultimately, it goes forward into the revenues of a state, of a city like LA. If you have the people at the bottom, able to move.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you say that, and I agree with that. When I lived in LA and I would go down that 405 every day, I would sit there, I'm like, okay, let me get this straight. What the hell am I doing? Spending 2 hours a day on the freaking 405 freeway. I landed one day at 3:30. I wanted to go from LAX to Rafi's place to eat. It's 18 miles. It took 2.5 hours to go there. I would not, what am I doing to go 2.5 hours in 18, 20 miles to go to a restaurant? So, and then I moved to Texas, and I had a guy sitting next to me who was a socialist. He's not a capitalist. And we were driving, and he says, man, I don't like the fact that we have to pay the toll here in Texas. I said, well, the way Texas works is you don't pay state taxes. If you don't want to use the toll, then don't use it. Take the streets. You don't have to pay the tax. But in Texas, you pay taxes for things you use. In California, you pay for things you'll never use. Like they had an express road here in Texas, Dallas, and I would pay the money to go through this express, but there's only 2 cars, and I'm like, I'll pay this, no problem. I'm able to go past 300 cars. I never saw that in California. So when you're talking about, and by the way, this is a man that left California at 37 years old, prime money making years, and I'm going to be making money for another 20, 30 years. And they could have gotten a lot of those taxes, but they abused it. And I'm seeing a massive exodus with a lot of younger other people that relate to what I'm saying. So going back to, you said you believe in fair capitalism. I think that's the word you use. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I think you said fair capitalism, and you believe in democratic socialism, which is an element of what Bernie talks about. But Bernie also talks about 70%, and you were a supportive of Bernie. I think you guys did some work together. He relied on you on some of the economic stuff. What are your thoughts when we're talking about 70% of taxes and just bashing rich people, the top 1% of America? They're just so this, and they're doing this, and they're doing, oh my gosh. You feel guilty to talk about the fact that you make some money. There used to be a time people admired successful people. I mean, you're somebody that's made millions of dollars. You're somebody that's very successful. You're somebody that essentially is top 1%. If you worked at Goldman Sachs as a top person, you are 1%. What's wrong with going to the 1%? And here's the thing. I don't want to be in a Bernie bash moment, because I truly believe a Bernie against the Trump stood a better chance than a Biden against the Trump, because at least you know what Bernie stands. And that's one of the things I respect about Bernie. Bernie's Bernie. You don't know where Biden's at. When I looked at Bernie, I'm like, you know what? It doesn't matter if I disagree with this guy. I respect the guy that has his own ways of fixing things, and he doesn't flip-flop. And I would have loved to see those two guys going at it, but unfortunately, I don't think we're ever going to see that, although it would have been incredible debates people would have tuned into. So going back to it, I watch your videos, and I've watched your interview with Bernie that you guys did, I think in 2013 or 2016. I don't know what it was. It was many
2009.
2009. I watched that as well. I watched a lot of your work. You seem very reasonable. You seem fair. You seem like you're able to stay in the middle and kind of hear both sides of the argument out. How does someone like you, as reasonable you are, get behind 70% for rich people?
So the work I did with Bernie was mostly on the Fed and the idea of, and on Wall Street. So the idea of basically creating, going back to fairness, sort of an auditing path, a transparency path, seeing what the Fed was doing, where it went, who was getting the most benefit. And this ties in. And also from the standpoint of Wall Street banks, to what extent were they basically creating securities and, that was hiding or the risk that ultimately we had all seen in the economy and the financial system, which I believe still exists. It's been papered over, the Fed's thrown money at it, so it's deeper in the system, but it's there. And I think that, so that's what I'm talking about when I talk about a fair environment. From the standpoint of 70% for of all of rich people, if you take someone and wherever you calibrate that number and you say 70% of all of your income is gone, I do think from an income standpoint, not a wealth standpoint, I think that's very high. From a gradient, which is where I would disagree with an absolute level like that. What I'm saying is that there should be some sort of a gradient between someone more wealthy paying more of the initial part of their income relative to sort of a number that is that high. So it becomes proportional. You're not paying 70%. I don't believe it's necessary to pay 70% of your income. But I'll say this too. I think companies should pay more in taxes to avoid some of these situations in terms of getting money into the budget of our country, into reducing the deficit of our country, which of course now has grown because of the virus, and it does grow because of different crises. I think that rather than not paying taxes into the revenue of the Treasury Department, which right now companies pay about 10 to 13% of the full amount of revenue that goes into our coffers as a nation, it used to be much higher than that. There's maybe a happy medium, but because they're not paying as much, just mathematically, there's a greater amount to be covered in order to run the country. And if there's a greater amount to be covered in order to run the country, and it's not coming from growth, which I think would be the better way to do it, we talked about economic growth earlier, then having a proportional tax system allows some of that to be retrieved, not all of it, not making up for companies not putting as much in, and not necessarily going to that absolute level for everyone who is wealthy in terms of their income. But I do think there's a give and take there. I think that's a high number. I don't. But I also think that we have to, as a nation, use that money, whatever it is, for things that actually sustain economic growth. And companies and individuals and rich people could be doing that. It's not to say that that's not happening, but to the extent that taxes are taken out, they should give benefit to the overall country, and the overall growth of our country. And I think that helps both the people at the bottom, as well as those who are wealthier, because you just have better roads. Like it might take you 2.5 hours to go anywhere once coronavirus is over, out of LA to anywhere else. That could still happen. But the idea is that you have a more efficient system, whether it's technological or infrastructure wise, because money's going into things that everyone can use, not just rich, not just poor, but all of us.
And you think governments are being efficient right now with our taxes?
No.
So why would taxpayers feel confident constantly paying more taxes while the government can go out there and print money in quantitative easing, give it to whoever they want, and I'm sitting here working my ass off, making 80 grand a year, 100 to whoever it is, $150,000 a year, and barely seeing my kids, and I'm seeing them being bailed out, but I have to pay 50% of my taxes to you, and I'm not seeing the roads getting better. I'm not seeing streets getting better. I have a very hard time with that.
That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. The fact is, we shouldn't pay taxes into this massive quantitative easing, money creation into just sort of a market perspective, rather than building the roads or having faster trains or whatever it might be, or having better hospitals or more efficient, testing system now, or whatever it might be. I absolutely, I totally agree with that. We have mismanaged the creation of money, let alone our taxes, because we mismanaged both effectively. But throwing the QE into it, throwing the Federal Reserve's balance sheet into it, throwing that massive inflation of just the availability of cheap money that doesn't go into doing anything. I mean, I don't even see lines on the 101 when I get out of LA, and they don't paint them. They're old. You just make up your own lanes.
That's the point, though. Why are they paying 13.3? And here's the thing, though, because look, I was telling you earlier, I lived there 24 years, and we're looking at 4 other places to go live, and we were looking to go back to, somewhere around what is that place right by Agora Hills? It's right outside of Agora Hills. It's a nice area. We're looking at Malibu. We're looking at Newport, right? We want to go back to LA. I'm LA. My friends are there. Everything I know is LA. 24 years, from 12 years old to 37. I'm LA, minus me being in the military. We looked at Greenwich. We looked at Florida. We looked at Texas. California went from first place to last place in no time, because they keep saying, pay more taxes, gas tax, this tax. And California's like, okay, how many more things you're going to keep raising, and nothing is getting better? So a question for you. Who are you comfortable having more power? People, government, or companies? In order, if you were to say 1, 2, 3, what would you say?
I would say people, companies, and government.
We're on the same page. Okay. We're on the same page. So I feel like I can talk to you for hours. I'm really enjoying this. I thought this was going to be an hour interview, and I told you, I said this is going to be an hour because I have meetings. I'm already hour and 45 minutes we've been together, because I'm having a blast with you. I respect the way you reason and process issues. It's very trusting, the way you process issues. I can't say that about everybody, but I can say that definitely about you, and I appreciate that. Let's do a quick speed round. I'll give you a name. Tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. And if you don't have anything to say about it, just say I have nothing to say about it. We'll be fine as well. Bernie Sanders.
Better against Trump.
Milton Friedman.
We don't have free markets anymore.
Biden.
Kind of not clear on his policies.
Fair enough. Karl Marx.
Not great for women, but had some good.
Okay. All right. Barack Obama.
Diplomatic.
I agree. Trump.
Knee jerk.
I think that's a fair assessment. Richard Wolff.
Academic.
Safe. Arthur Laffer.
I know he's a Marxist, but he's also an academic. That just came to my mind.
Arthur Laffer.
Don't know.
Okay. Alan Greenspan.
Out of his league. Hurt risk because of derivatives.
Friedrich Hayek. Don't know. Okay. Ludwig von Mises.
Libertarian.
Interesting. I'll finish with that one. First of all, I really enjoyed our time together. Thank you so much for making the time to be a guest and took all the questions that we went together with. Very, very good perspective. I'm certain the audience enjoyed the interviews just as much as I did. And once again, thank you for taking the time and being a guest on Valuetainment.
Thank you so much for having me on, Patrick. Be well.
Anyway, take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
I've had a lot of different economists and folks that are in the financial world that have their own opinions, but this one was slightly different. I'm curious your thoughts about what she said regarding China, India, Iran, that connection there, and then the topic with the creature of Jekkyl Island, the amount of research she had done. I'd never interviewed anybody that knew this much about the creatures of Jekkyl Island and how J.P. Morgan funded World War I when dealing with Teddy Roosevelt and some of the things that I had handy there with Woodrow Wilson. What were your thoughts about that? And last but not least, when I shared my sentiment about California and taxes, and you heard what she said about it, she worked closely with Bernie Sanders, but she had some stuff to say about taxes. I want to hear your thoughts on those topics. And outside of that, I got 2 interviews. If you enjoyed this interview, I have 2 other interviews I want you to watch. One of them is with 9-year Dallas Federal Reserve expert who talks on TV all the time about finance. If you've never watched my interview with Daniel DiMartino Booth, it's an incredible interview. Click over here. And the other one is someone that I asked her about, where I said, what do you think about Richard Wolff? And she said, academic. And I said, safe answer. And she laughed. If you've not watched this one got heated, but it was a friendly debate. Click over here to watch this. And if you've not subscribed to the channel, please do so. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.